Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thanks for coming. Today I'll be talking about video game history, computer game history, and I'll be talking about some differences and similarities between how games are being produced by professionals and amateurs. And in particular, I'm going to look at the 1980s, because that's where most of my research in my previous project was. I was looking at the history of computer games in behind the Iron Curtain in 1980s Czechoslovakia. So here you can see a picture of Matthew Smith, a very influential and famous British programmer from the 1980s, and on the right, it's Libor Bederlík, who was like an amateur Czech programmer, also from the 1980s. And I'm just using these images to kind of put them one, beside each other. They're both young people, but they lived in very sort of different contexts, and they were creating games in very different contexts. As Jan has mentioned, a lot of this talk is based on my upcoming book, Gaming the Iron Curtain, which is coming out very soon. But a lot of it is also actually quite new, so the material that I'll be presenting about Manic Miner, a lot of it is new, and it's based on a chapter that I'm writing for a book about transnational culture exchanges during the Cold War, and it's co-edited by Marek Pajala from University of Turku and by Alice Lovejoy from the States. And also you may just to mention, so this is the research on computer games in Czechoslovakia is sort of my previous project. Right now, I'm actually working at the University of Bergen on a new project which is about video game monsters and monsters in video games. So if you're interested in that and just want to chat about that later, very happy to be talking about video game monsters as well. Okay, so I'll be looking at the potential differences between amateur and professional game making. One of the reasons why I chose this topic is that the culture of excellence, and especially the group here in Bergen, here in Tampere, is interested in production studies and how games are being produced. So I'm looking at these differences. I'll be looking at infrastructure, so the context in which these games are being created, at how programming and making games is being framed by the media, for instance. What's the economy behind it, which will be very different in the two cases. I'll be looking at authorship, at the questions of who is considered an author of a game. Also, there will be some differences, and I will be talking about what is the identity of a game as an artifact. Where does one game stop being the same game when it's being converted, for instance, to other platforms. I'm drawing on all kinds of material. A lot of it is interview material, and here you can see one of my interview subjects, Vlastimil Veselý, who is the author of one of the games that I'll be talking about. But I really kind of made a point out of meeting these people in person, so I did over 40 personal face-to-face interviews with people in Czechoslovakia who were, now the Czech Republic, but before that Czechoslovakia, who were active in the 1980s on the homebrew programming scene. I was also drawing from all kinds of archival material, like computer club newsletters, and also the games. So most of the games that I'll be mentioning, and you'll see screenshots from them, most of them are still available, and you can play them with emulators, you can download them from various online repositories. So if you want to do that, just you can just ask me. I can sort of give you some links and where to find these games. I won't be talking that much about theory, but I just want to mention a few articles that were an inspiration while I was working on this particular topic of clones and adaptations. There was a group in Germany writing about copies, clones, and genres. There's an article in the International Journal of Communication by Katzenbach, Herweg, and Lies van Ressel. And also, if you're interested in the idea of cloning and the idea of making conversions, there are two very nice articles that came out in this issue of the Well Played journal, which is dedicated to European video games of the 1980s. So there's one about Finland by Petri Saarikoski, Jaakko Suominen, and Markku Reunanen, and there's one about clones in Italy by Riccardo Fassone. Okay, so my first case will be Manic Miner, which was a very famous game in the early 80s. And I'll be talking about first a little bit about the context in the UK, then about how the game was made, and then we will sort of make the journey into Czechoslovakia. In the second case, which will be Flappy, I will just go straight to the point. But here, I will spend some time explaining the context. So let us look at the 1980s Britain. So initially, the UK was kind of lagging behind the US and Japan in terms of development of computing and also home computing and the game industry. But they caught on quite fast in the early 80s. So there was a pretty evolved commercial infrastructure of stores where you could buy computers, so you could buy hardware, software, and so on. You could even starting at around 1982 or 3, you could actually buy computer games at newsstands also. So there was like a very kind of elaborate distribution structure. And there was an industry booming already around 1982. Matthew Smith, who is the author of Manic Miner, got his first computer in 1979. It was a TRS-80 computer manufactured by the Tandy Corporation. And he bought it in one of these Tandy stores. Tandy was an American company, but they had a chains of stores in Europe as well. And one of his kind of first experiences programming and learning about programming was actually in these Tandy stores. This is not the actual one in Liverpool, but he lived in Liverpool, and I mean it probably looked similar. So he would go to the Tandy store, as he kind of remembers, and there would be a group of kids who would program on the computers that they had there in the store. And they would just kind of get a culture into this, culture of programming. They would also sometimes get small commissions from people. So they would program something from somebody for money. And those were, back then, they were like 12-year-old kids. But you could see that like already at that point, they are kind of being encultured into programming as a job. So already in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, there was this idea that you can make money programming. Matthew was a pretty eccentric person. I think you can kind of sense that from the photographs of him. But he was very smart and he was very talented as a programmer. And the local company Bugbyte, founded in the early 80s, approached him in 1981 and they asked him to basically make games. And he started out making games for the TRS-80, but then this happened. The Sinclair Zx Spectrum came out in 1982, which turned out to be a very influential and very popular computer in the UK and in many other European countries. What differentiated the Sinclair Zx Spectrum from other computers like the TRS was primarily the price. It was a very cheap machine. So it started at 125 British pounds, which was very cheap for that time, much cheaper than the Commodore 64 or other machines that were available on the market at that time. And this popularized home computing to an extent that was unforeseen before. And at that time, UK was based on kind of partial statistics. I mean, I would argue that the proliferation of home computers in people's households was the highest in the UK out of all kind of Western civilized world at that time, thanks to very cheap computers that were available on the market. So when this computer was becoming big, Bugbyte actually bought one and they loaned it to Matthew Smith, who would then start making games for the Spectrum. So he was already kind of commissioned to make games for the Spectrum. So he was still kind of like a scruffy teenager. He was about like 16 years old when he started to make his his popular games. But he was also pretty, sophisticated about the whole thing. So sometimes when we look at the 1980s, we imagine that there's just kind of one guy sitting at a computer, and they were usually men, right? So one guy sitting at a computer, and just that one computer, and coding like straight into the computer. But it was actually not really true. Matthew Smith already in 1983, when he was making Manic Miner, he was using a pretty sophisticated environment, development environment. So you can see that he has the TRS-80, so that's that computer. And he has the Spectrum right here. He has floppy disks, and the Spectrum didn't really use floppy disks, so he had that for the TRS. And he was writing the code on the TRS and then feeding it using these parallel cables into the Spectrum, so that he could kind of test the program while he was coding. So this was a pretty sophisticated system. He made it himself with just soldering iron, and it was like a homemade solution, but he was pretty sophisticated about that. The game, of which you can see a screenshot here, came out in 1983, in the summer of 1983, and it was almost immediately a huge hit. It was inspired by games like Donkey Kong. There was also an American game for the Atari called Miner 2000 and 49er, and both of these influenced the design of Manic Miner. So it's a platformer, like an action game. You mostly jump, you avoid monsters like this guy, and you have to collect keys, and then you go to the exit, which you can see here. And this is how all levels in this game unfold. There is kind of a really interesting sense of humor to the whole game. For instance, when you die, when you lose all the lives, this kind of Monty Python-esque foot kind of descends on the player and kind of crushes him. And it's just like one of the small jokes. In one of the levels, the enemies are these mutant telephones, and you have these mutant toilets, and it's just like a lot of in-jokes, and a lot of small kind of funny touches. When the game came out, it was welcomed by the gaming press, which was also already quite evolved in 1983 in the UK. The reviewers said that it had impressive graphics, highly original scenarios, amusing, and that it was original, amusing, and habit-forming, and that was actually considered like a good thing. And it had humor, horror, and wholesome addiction, if that exists. And back then, in the 1980s, especially in the British press, the word addictive was used as a positive adjective. So if a game was addictive, it was good. Manic Miner came out as a commercial product. You could buy it at a store, you could buy it at a newsstand. It was put out on a cassette tape. So here you can see the Spectrum versions, and here you can see the tapes. It was also then officially re-released for other platforms, for the Amstrad and for other platforms. So there were some conversions being done in-house. Matthew Smith actually made a lot of money on this game. So first, I mentioned that he was hired by Bug Byte Software, but Bug Byte Software was kind of slow on paying him royalties. So he took the game with him, and kind of helped by a lawyer. He kind of created his own company, Software Projects. You can see the logo here. So he created his own company and published the game again, almost the same game. And that's where kind of the money started rolling in for him. And he knew that he had a hit on his hands and really kind of wanted to kind of capitalize on that. And he also had some kind of outside help from lawyers and from his kind of entrepreneur friends and so on. So this game was a commercial product that was protected by copyright. And Matthew Smith was also kind of covered by the gaming magazines at that time. And his persona was constructed as this kind of programming rock star. They called him the Merchant of Mayhem. I think that there's a clear precedent to this kind of approach to kind of creative professionals, and that is British music magazines, right? So they present him in a way that music magazines were used to portraying musicians, rock musicians and punk rock musicians. So he became this kind of persona. You can see here on the left is actually an illustration from the Sinclair User magazine in 1984. And this is sort of like a pastiche or a parody of the cover of his second game, the sequel to Manic Miner called Jet Set Willy. The cover is something like this, but here you can see instead of the character Willy, so this guy, I forgot to mention that, this guy is called Miner Willy. He's the main character. But instead of Willie, you can see Matthew Smith here. What the press wrote about him. He is now the most famous programmer in the country, the embodiment of the otherwise spurious myth of the school millionaire. And what he said about himself: I like partying, getting drunk, and falling over a lot. And so he started this kind of rock and roll lifestyle. He became very frustrated with the industry and with the pressure that was put on him, because he became this kind of rock star, and everybody was looking forward to the next game. He made Jet Set Willy in 1984, the sequel to Manic Miner, and then he was kind of employed by a software project. I mean, he co-owned it, and it was kind of running on for 4 more years, but he never made another game, and he hasn't made any games since. And then he kind of got lost, and he moved to the Netherlands, and he worked kind of manual jobs in like a fish factory or something in the Netherlands. And he had, like, his life story is really interesting. He was like this hero and victim of the early game industry in a way. Manic Miner was immensely influential. It sort of co-created a variation of the platformer genre that was popular on the 8-bit computers. And there were games like, and you know, you can just see by the titles. I mean, they were inspired not only the genre was similar, but also the titles. Dynamite Dan and Monty Mole. I mean, there were different characters, but the gameplay was pretty much the same or very similar. They introduced new characters, they introduced kind of new settings, but the basics were the same. But still, I mean, it was a copyrighted program, so they couldn't just make Manic Miner 2, right? That was possible. Okay, so now let's move to Czechoslovakia. It was a country behind the Iron Curtain, obviously, which, I mean, had several kind of effects on the development of computing there. So one thing is that computers were not really easily available, and neither was software. So there was no hardware or software market, and there were these barriers to the trade with the West. You couldn't just go into a store and buy a Sinclair Zx Spectrum. It was more difficult. The country was producing some of its own computers, especially the PMD-85 will be important for our story in a bit. The IQ-151 and the PMD-85 were computers that were manufactured in Czechoslovakia, but they were not sold in stores. They were sold directly to institutions. So directly to schools, or sometimes also computer clubs that we'll be talking about in a minute. Both of these computers that were kind of, had some kind of impact in Czechoslovakia were kind of inferior to the machines that were produced in the West at that time. Because, most of the entire Soviet bloc was lagging behind the West in terms of computing technology. But still, people wanted to get hold of Western technology. And those, and I said that the Czechoslovak computers weren't really available for you to buy. So what people did was that either they went to these special stores with imported goods, they waited in long lines for the very few computers that were imported. This is actually a line for color TVs, but a line for computers would be very similar. Or they could kind of travel to the West and buy the computer there, but not everybody could do that. You had to have a special permit. It was not easy at all, but people would kind of find a relative or a friend who was permitted to travel to the West, and then they would bring computers over, or games. So there would be a pretty big user base of Western computers in the country. So I said that Czechoslovakia was kind of lagging behind the West in a way, but at the same time the government was supporting programming and computing, especially in terms of programming education. They wanted to educate these young programmers who would then kind of work in their jobs in state-owned factories or institutions and so on, or in the army. So the goal was not really to create a game industry or a software industry. The goal was to educate them so that then they are kind of hired by these kind of state-owned companies. But still, there was support for programming, and the state subsidized computer clubs, which were affiliated either with schools or with paramilitary organizations, or with kind of some kind of youth organizations. Here you can see a picture from one of those. It's the stationary technicians in Prague. And you can see the grammar school student František Fuka, yeah, the guy who's standing, showing his friends at the stationary technicians his own new creation, a computer game. And this is from 1986. And by then, you know, he's already made a few games, and his friends have already made some games. What you cannot really see here that well is that they're using a Sinclair Zx Spectrum. You can kind of tell it by the size, because it was a very, very tiny computer. And the Spectrum was very popular in the country, and one of the reasons while Spectrum was being imported from the West was that it was very, very tiny. It was like this big. So it could be quite easily smuggled, because otherwise you'd have to pay customs fees that were pretty high. So what people did, and I've been told this in some interviews, that you would kind of, for instance, like buy a box of chocolates and eat the chocolates, and put the Spectrum into the box of chocolates, and then you would kind of pretend that, you know, I haven't opened this box of chocolates, and you would just like be led through the borders without paying the customs fees. Or you could also kind of bribe the customs officials, right? That was also a possibility. So the Spectrum was being imported individually by people traveling from the West into the country, and soon there was a pretty large community, about tens of thousands of users, which is quite a lot. And with the Spectrum, with the hardware, also you know, software started to flow into the country. And the question is how Manic Miner as a game actually made it into the country. So I showed you the cassette tapes. And I think that at this, in 1983, I think the most likely option was that somebody who was, you know, buying a computer in the West just bought, you know, a few cassettes with games, and then they brought it into the country with them. Later, there were kind of more sophisticated kind of systems of distribution. So starting in around 1985, most of the software would actually kind of travel through either Poland or Yugoslavia to Czechoslovakia in pirated copies. So no original copies were transferred into the country anymore. But in 1983, still, I would, based on interviews and all kinds of materials, I would sort of expect that somebody actually brought a physical copy from the West into one of those clubs, and then it started spreading. Just like in the West or in the UK, people in Czechoslovakia loved Manic Miner. So you could see that in the memories of players who were active in the 1980s, they say that it was absolutely legendary. It was a classic. And also in preserved published materials, we can see that already in 1985, one of the Computer Club newsletters says that it's a classic game. So it was 2 years after it was put out, which makes it almost an instant classic. So it was just as popular in Czechoslovakia as it was in the UK. But at the same time, people in Czechoslovakia didn't really know that much about the business of game industry in the UK. So what you would get is a copy of a game, you know, on tape. You wouldn't have the original kind of paratextual material. You wouldn't have the packaging. You didn't know, you know, that much about the company that made it. You might know a little bit about the author. Like the information would kind of filter through, you know, kind of many kind of mediators into the country. So you were left with kind of very limited information about the genesis of the game and about the workings of the game industry. So what one of the interviewees told me, we knew that Manic Miner was written by a 15-year-old. What we didn't know was that he made money on it, started to drink and do drugs, and ruin himself. We, or at least I, didn't see the business behind it because we didn't know about it. And the funny fact here is that he wasn't even 15 years old. He was actually older when he made the game. So Matthew Smith was about 17 years old when he made the game, which is young, you know, to create a software blockbuster. But still, it's not 15. And this kind of myth of of Matthew Smith as this sort of young genius, like this boy who creates games, was kind of very prevalent in Czechoslovakia. And I think it kind of had something to do with the support for youth groups that taught programming. He was kind of put forward as this role model of a guy who, aged 15, or some people even said 14, he made this amazing game, and you can be like him. Right? So he was this, he became this role model, like very much untrue to his status in the UK, where he was seen like, as a total rock star, and then as a kind of total has-been. The context in Czechoslovakia was very different, and the act of making games was seen differently and framed differently. And games like Manic Miner were not primarily seen as commercial products, but as sort of like things to explore. Hacking was very much encouraged because I mean most of this activity took place in these non-commercial, non-profit, kind of state-sponsored clubs, and what they thought was programming. And games were seen as sort of like this raw material that you can do something with, and you can kind of learn programming by analyzing these games. This is a quote from 1988, but I think like that it kind of encapsulates the kind of the spirits. But I think that this approach kind of started much earlier than 1988. They write, "Only a few programs are polished into the state of perfection, attractiveness, and user-friendliness to the extent that computer games are. I do think that beginners should delve into simple games and take them apart. An extraordinarily suitable game is, for example, the good old Manic Miner, written by a 15-year-old. Again, we can see that they kind of represent his age. So yeah, people were encouraged to kind of play around with those games. And I kind of have a question about time, because we started like 10 minutes later. So
we went to like 50 something.
Yeah. So they were doing all kinds of modifications with these games. So they were poking, which meant like doing these simple hacks that had the effect, for example, of like adding infinite lives or all kinds of gameplay quirks. They made conversions and ports. They did mashups and imitations. So I kind of outline these categories now, and I will talk about each of them in a bit. And I just want to say one thing that I personally consider important, and that is that a conversion is not a port. So when games are being transferred from one computer platform to another, or game platform to another, they're often called ports, but sometimes they're called conversions. And I think it's important to distinguish between these. I talked about conversions when it's a game that is supposed to kind of represent the original, but it's programmed from scratch. Whereas port is just taking the original code and modifying it in, like to some extent so that it works on the target machine. It's not just starting with a blank slate and programming the game from scratch. The first conversion made in Czechoslovakia of Manic Miner came out already in 1984. So it was less than a year after it was released in the UK. So you can imagine that, it must have taken some time, weeks or months for the game to get into the country. And then in the summer of 1984, a conversion for the ZX81 already came out. It was made by Aleš Martiník, who was a student of the Brno University of Technology. And it was quite an achievement. He says, "My motivation was 20% the desire to play Manic Miner, even though I only had a ZX81. And the remaining 80% was the desire to prove to myself, but mainly others, that I'm good enough to pull it off, at both of which I succeeded." So you can see that there's this kind of motivation by showing off, this kind of economy of prestige, right? Like getting credit for making something. Although it's just a conversion, it doesn't matter, but you really did something important. You brought this game onto the ZX81, which was an inferior computer, and it was very hard to pull off to create a game that played almost the same. Just get this. So in the end, if we look at the conversions and ports, 3 different versions of the game were made in Czechoslovakia. Conversions, at least 3. So the ZX81 for the PMD85, the computer that I showed you before, and for Sharp MZ800. We'll talk about it a little bit later. You can see that, I mean, there are some interesting differences here. Can you spot differences?
Scoring? Why is there only one score on the top one, but 2 on the one below?
Okay, so this is high score.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, yeah, the other, so the original, which is here, doesn't show the high score. I mean, shows the high score, but that one doesn't, and that one doesn't either. Yeah, and that one does. Yeah, so that's one difference.
Does the one for the PMD have an inventory? Because it says Vietzi.
Yeah.
Get the things
Yeah.
that you have.
So somebody knows Czech. No, well, it doesn't have an inventory. You just collect the keys as you did in the original version. But I mean, in the original version, it didn't tell you how many you have collected. This is kind of, I don't think it really serves any kind of important gameplay function. But the display of the PMD was kind of, the aspect ratio was different, so I think they kind of felt the need to kind of put something there, perhaps. But there is actually one. Okay, so let me say one thing. So this is kind of the initial moment in the game. So assume that you haven't lost any lives yet.
So the difference in lives.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of saying something interesting, right? So in the original you have 3 lives, including the one on the screen, and here you have 8, and there you have 6 and 6. So the game is kind of considerably kind of less difficult in the Czechoslovak versions, which I mean is a reaction to the pretty high difficulty of the original. Back then, you know, games were kind of still shaped by the kind of arcade game conventions of difficulty. I mean, that meant very difficult. And at the same time, it was very common for people to kind of add lives by poking, by sort of hacking the game. So I would kind of assume that the number of lives was not really considered a feature that would kind of define gameplay. It didn't really kind of matter that much because you could always kind of, you know, have infinite lives anyway. So this kind of made the game a little bit more playable. And of course, I mean, there are some differences in graphics that kind of reflected the features of the individual platforms. Also, what you can see here is the translations. So people would translate the names of the individual levels into Czechoslovak based on what their language was. I'll just show a bit of gameplay of the original and then of one of the conversions. And there's one more kind of important difference here. So we don't have sound. I mean, the sound is not that important. So this is one of the kind of most famous levels, and I'll just forward it to so you can see the platforming action. I'll just forward it a little bit. So you can see that Minor Willie is jumping up there. And this is the alien Kong beast. And by switching this lever, you kind of trigger this scripted action, and the Kong beast kind of falls down. Whereas in one of the conversions, you can see that there's just like no Kong beast at all. And this kind of shows some of the limits of these conversions. Basically what they did was they converted or they rewrote the engine of the game. But whenever there was like scripted sequence that was unique, it was much harder for people to actually code these specific occurrences, these kind of unique elements in the individual levels. So sometimes they just kind of gave up. So there's no Kong beast here, which really kind of changes the gameplay of this particular level. I mean, otherwise, you can see that it is actually pretty, I'm sorry, I keep skipping, but otherwise you can see that it's actually pretty faithful. And this is a conversion, it was written from scratch. So you can see, I mean, they must have known the original game very well. to make something that feels so similar. The names of the levels were sometimes mistranslated and in funny ways. So in the original game, there's a level called The Warehouse, which is translated as Warehouse, Dům války for the Czech speaking audience members. Menagerie, which kind of features these animals kind of running around, is translated as Mine Management, or Správa bane in Slovak. Endorian Forest, which is clearly a reference to what?
Star Wars.
Yeah. Star Wars wasn't really, I mean, some people obviously knew about it in Czechoslovakia in the 1980s, but it was actually never shown in movie theaters until 1991. So, I mean, a lot of people just didn't know this reference, and they just translated it as Forbidden Forest. And the VAT, which kind of doesn't really make much sense. I mean, they mean, yeah. Even in the original, I'm kind of wondering why it's called the VAT, and they just very descriptively translate it as the cannon and the 3 kangaroos, because there are 3 kangaroos. So you can see that people, like, although they're kind of remaking a game that already exists, they're always kind of inserting like their own takes on the game, their interpretation of the content, their take on the difficulty of the game, and their kind of take on what is important and what's not, or what's doable or what's not. There were not only conversions, but also mashups, so games that are kind of taking bits of the original game, but making something kind of different with it. So this was this game called Willy Walker, also for the PMD, or a game, confusingly, called Manic Miner from 1987, which is completely different. So you have, I mean, the miner Willy is there, right? You can see him, but the gameplay is completely different. Like you can see the ladders and kind of the poles that you can climb. And it plays completely differently, but it's called Manic Miner because you can do that if you're in Czechoslovakia and copyright means nothing. It's interesting to look at how the original author was credited. So I mean, Matthew Smith was one of the kind of few famous programmers that people kind of knew some things about, even though, I mean, you couldn't get British magazines in Czechoslovakia, but people kind of knew about Matthew Smith. And he was also, his name was in the original game. So in this conversion, what they said was authors, and Vít Libovický and Daniel Jene, the guys who programmed the conversion, screenplay and shapes Matthew Smith, which I think is an interesting way of creating Matthew Smith. I mean, he did create the scenarios, he created the graphics, but they considered themselves authors. Because in the 80s, in Czechoslovakia, but also to some extent in the West, authorship was very much associated with authorship of the program, not really the design, but the program. In one of these mashups, you can read that it's from foreign materials, adapted and written by Karel Šuhajda. And he doesn't specify which foreign materials, but it's obvious that it's games by Matthew Smith. And there were also imitations. I'll go through the second case very fast. There's just one point that I want to show to you. So Flappy, like Manic Miner, was a very influential game in Czechoslovakia, and that was for one reason. It was because of this machine, Sharp MZ800. It was one of the few computers that you could actually buy in Czechoslovakia starting in mid-80s. And that was because of the deal that Czechoslovak government made with the Japanese government. And reportedly, and I mean, this is sort of like apocryphal, but the explanation that I get often is that the shipment of these computers was exchanged with Japan for a shipment of wooden spoons. And thanks to this deal, the Sharp MZ800, a computer that was popular nowhere else, became popular, then Japan and Czechoslovakia became popular in the country. And with it, the game Flappy, which is this kind of action puzzle hybrid in which are you familiar with Boulder Dash? It's a bit similar. So this character here kind of pushes these stones, and he has to push the blue one onto this kind of blue slot. So so that's the goal of the game. Vlastimil Veselý remade the game. Once again, he was sort of motivated by sort of showing off. It was a bet of sorts. Bet you wouldn't pull that off, and I said I would. Here it placed the original credit with his own credit or with the credit of his collective, VBG software. And in 1987, he published his game. It is remarkably faithful. But there is one important difference, which I will document right now. So you can see the original Flappy character from the original game. What kind of animal do you think that is? Well, that's an interesting answer. Yeah, you're not the only one who thought it was a chicken. Yeah.
Looks like a kiwi from the New Zealand story Amiga game, which came later. That's quite a bit of resemblance.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to say because it's very pixelated, but in the original game, it was supposed to be a mole. So you can see that this is like the rendition of the mole on the paratext of the original game, so it's on the packaging. But Vlastimil Veselý, who made the Czech version, actually also thought that it was a chicken. And so this was arms, right? Like obviously in the original. So it's just like kind of shuffling his arms like this when he's walking around. But as you can see in the conversion, Vlastimil Veselý actually kind of remade them as wings. And because he didn't have access to the original paratextual information, he even kind of made up his own story that he inserted in the game. And the story, the instruction of the game says, help the chicken called Flappy get the white egg onto the white platform. And you can, so it's reinterpreted as a chicken. And you can even see that on the loading screen of the game, you can see Flappy on these sort of castle battlements. Whereas the original game, when you look at the manuals, like they're set in this kind of mine complex somewhere on like an alien planet or something. But Veselý situates the game on a castle, which can also make sense because then that is the kind of environment that when you grow up in Czechoslovakia, that's like something that you see like almost everywhere, like castles everywhere. So he set it in a castle. So once again, like what he didn't know, he replaced with his own interpretation of what he thought the game was about. And there were more versions of Flappy. Okay, so let's get to the conclusion. This kind of approach to original game artifacts was not unique to these titles. People were kind of borrowing characters and borrowing sprites and borrowing graphics and pieces of program from Western software. Indiana Jones became a popular character in Czechoslovak games, and of course, like none of these games with Indiana Jones were licensed. One of the chapters in the book deals with activist games that protested communist regime, and that's not what we're talking about right now. And I just want to point out that there's this that even in these games, people were borrowing from existing Western games. So this is a loading screen of a game called 17/11/1989, and it's about the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And it was released 2 days after the demonstrations. And the loading screen is actually just a redrawn loading screen of the way of the exploding fist. So once again, you can see that people are treating Western games as this raw material with which they can kind of work and of which they can create bricolages in their own work. We've seen similarities between amateurs and professionals. I mean, they were young people. Most of them, I mean, started out as like with no money, as like a sort of bedroom operations. But in the West, I mean, you could become big and you could become famous and rich. But I mean, you could also become a victim of the computer industry. Whereas in Czechoslovakia, it was all kind of non-profit amateur work. There were differences in infrastructure. So on the one hand, you have software houses. On the other, non-profit state-sponsored clubs. Programming was framed as, on the one hand, being like a rock star. On the other hand, being educated to become this kind of wholesome kind of programmer figure in a state industry. In the West, most of the motivation for creating games and for the industry to flourish was, commercial profit, whereas in Czechoslovakia it was prestige. Authorship was viewed differently, and copyright. the lack of copyright protection in most of Eastern Europe actually kind of contributed to the fact that there were like all these different kinds of conversions, ports, and mashups, and nobody really could do anything about it because the Western companies didn't have power or any kind of motivation to litigate with amateurs in Czechoslovakia, for instance. And we've seen some kind of ideas about what constitutes an identity of the game. Right? So, is it still the same game if we take out, the Kong Beast? I mean, some people thought that it was. I think this wouldn't really be permissible if it was like an official conversion, kind of sanctioned by software projects, the original publisher. Yeah, and that's it for me. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you so much. Sorry for going a bit over time, but we started a bit later.
Yeah. So we can take a couple of questions, I think, and just ask you to repeat the question for the stream.
Sure.
So, any questions?
Yeah.
So there was absolutely zero economic motivation for that. I mean, they didn't have any possibility to get like economic return from this activity in communist Czechoslovakia.
That is true, yeah.
Can you just like...
Oh, okay, so the question was if there was no way of people getting money for making games in Czechoslovakia. No, they couldn't. There were some differences. So it was not the whole Soviet bloc was like that. So in Poland, for instance, there were a few small, tiny kind of companies that would, kind of organizations that would publish games that you could buy. In Hungary, it was similar, but Czechoslovakia was actually one of the most restrictive in these terms. So you couldn't actually enterprise on your own. It was just impossible legally. You might have probably got, I don't know, like kind of pocket money from somebody, just like as like a thank you or something, or informally. I mean, there were pirates already back then, so who would sell games for money, but they would make much more money selling Western games than domestic games.
Was this game development culture in Czechoslovakia very different from the neighboring Soviet bloc countries?
Mm-hmm.
Or was there what were kind of like the similarities or differences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was whether in other countries in the Soviet bloc the game development culture was similar or different. So the context was usually very similar. So in most Soviet bloc countries you would have computer clubs as like the prominent hubs of programming activities for 8-bit computers. So that would be the same. But in terms of what games were being made, I think there are some differences, and I think it has to do with the fact that these countries were, to a large extent, kind of isolated. These cultures were kind of isolated from each other. There wasn't that much kind of travel between different countries. It was not nearly as globalized as today. So what emerged were some kind of national trends in a way. So in Czechoslovakia, for example, the activist games, kind of the anti-regime games, were quite unique, and I haven't kind of seen any examples in any other country. But it might be the case of just like somebody making the first one, and then other people kind of copying it. So you could kind of see these patterns kind of emerging in different countries because the communities were pitted sites and they were basically kind of copying each other. Yeah.
Because you said that the concept of copyright didn't really apply at that time. Was there a huge shift after the Velvet Revolution?
Mm-hmm.
Like, did it were people suddenly being penalized for copying games, or was there like a gradual process of coming to terms with, okay, we can't just take somebody else's work and repaint it in MS Paint and release it again?
Yeah. So the question was whether after the Velvet Revolution the attitudes to copyright changed. So it changed. The law changed. So the copyright for software was introduced in 1991, if I'm correct. It's in the book. I'm just kind of blanking out. I think it was 1991. It was actually earlier than in some other Eastern European countries. And already in 1990, small publishers kind of emerged who were publishing original games for money. And so there would be like this, like a very kind of short kind of moment when games for 8-bit computers were being sold commercially, and then it kind of moved on into 16-bit computers. But even then, some of the games were kind of unadmitted conversions. Even in 1992, there was a game called Atomics that was released commercially for the Spectrum in Czechoslovakia, and it was a conversion of an Amiga game. And I don't think there was any litigation or anything. I think that maybe at that time, still the idea of copyright was so much kind of focused on the authorship of the program that they might have said, we programmed this version, so it's actually our work. So they might have been kind of thinking that. So it was kind of gradual, and I don't think people were kind of penalized harshly even after the law changed. It really took some years, and into the 1990s, piracy was like the default way of getting games. It's changed since then, I think. Yeah. Any more questions or comments? Yeah,
if I may, it's always interesting to see this kind of sort of comparisons, cross-cultural things in digital culture and games culture. One of the things that we are constantly sort of looking for is this kind of national cultural differences, and whether there are some unique characteristics in certain cultures that do not exist elsewhere. This talk was really fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading the book. The thing seems to be, from Finnish perspective, that we don't have this kind of games so much based on the national epic of Finnish people or anything like that. We have Angry Birds and we have Max Payne. We have influences taken from the Hong Kong action cinema or from Disney cartoons. So do you see, in terms of the actual gaming content, anything that is sort of Czechoslovakian or related to the national roots, or is it basically this kind of amateur aesthetics and exploitation of the opportunities and that kind of questions that are, so the cultural context is more interesting than the cultural concept?
Yeah, so the question was whether there were any kind of specific patterns in content in Czechoslovak games that were related to Czechoslovak culture. And I think, so this, I was talking about kind of one kind of segment, which were conversion and ports, and then there were like a lot of original stuff. And much of that was inspired by Western games because they were very influential. So I mean, and Western content. So these Indiana Jones games, right? Like they were super popular. But at the same time, there were games that were based on, I mean, Czech or Slovak culture. So there was a pretty popular game called Pouch the Beetle, or Chrobák Truhlík in Slovak, or Brouk Pytlík in Czech, which was based on like a Czech children's story. Or there were games based on Czech history, like taking place in castles, of course. There were games, I actually had a slide like this on the bottom left is an adaptation of the Czech version of tic-tac-toe. And the Czech version of tic-tac-toe is called Piškvorky. And it's not played on 3x3 grid, but it's played on an like infinite grid. If you have enough graph paper, it can be infinite. Conversions or digital adaptations of that like were very popular because it was a very popular kind of non-digital game, and versions of it in digital were also very popular. Then there are, like if we go a bit later, there are games like Samorost by Amanita Design, which is, I mean, it doesn't use language. You wouldn't, I mean, I don't know how many people would say it was Czech, but it like pretty clearly follows in the tradition of Czech animation of the 60s and 70s, but just by the way it's done, it's made, the graphics are made. And today, one of the biggest hits coming from the country is Kingdom Come Deliverance, which actually takes place in Bohemia, like in the early 15th century. And I think now, the way they're thinking sometimes about these settings is that it's kind of exotic in a way, right? So how do you differentiate from other RPG games by setting it in another country like Bohemia in the 1400s? So yeah, so it's been. I think there's this kind of tension, and I think it kind of goes there and back all the time. Like sometimes, yeah, people just copy Western sources, and other times they look for inspiration in the national culture. More questions?
Yeah.
Oh, there's one more.
Well, was there any particular character or game that was kind of like very Czechoslovakian in some sense, or just kind of like a famous that was not aware or something like that?
Yeah. So that's a good question, and I think I can have maybe two from the 80s. So sorry.
Just repeat the question.
Okay. The question was if there is a character or a particular game that were specifically Czechoslovak that was influential or famous. So I think I think I'm online, yeah. So I can show. There was one game that was very popular. Okay, yeah. It's like this comedic text adventure game, Shatochin. It's written in Cyrillic, but the game is Slovak, and it's about this heroic Soviet soldier whose goal in the game is to kill John Rambo. So you can see that there is this kind of inspiration by Western sources, but at the same time, by Soviet kind of bloc sources. And it's sort of a parodic game, and it's made to seem very kind of pro-Soviet, but at the same time, there are many scenes in the game, especially like when you fail, when the main character, the heroic Soviet soldier, is kind of humiliated and kind of killed in different ways. And that's the way in which this particular game is subversive. It's a very kind of like well-written, funny game. And another game that from that era that is still actually being played and that was influential throughout the whole Soviet bloc is Tetris 2 by Fuchsoft. By actually the guy that you saw showing the game to the rest of the people in the computer club. He created. In 1990, he started working on it a bit earlier, the unofficial sequel to Tetris, and he credits very diligently the original authors of the game, and the game says this is just a variation of the amazing game Tetris made by these Soviet programmers and so on, and it's like a two-player competitive version of Tetris, and I think that to this day it's the best version of Tetris I've ever played. So I totally recommend this game, and it has amazing music, which kind of mixes Soviet and Czech folk songs. You cannot hear it now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think that we're at the end of the lecture, and like for people who want to continue discussing these things, we will have a reading circle session in like 15 minutes more or less, and we'll be discussing a chapter from Jaroslav's new book. So people included in the reading circle probably have already got the chapter, but yeah, I think anyone can participate because it is in a way connected to the lecture that Jaroslav gave right now. So thank you.
Thank you.